Your brain is not broken. And you are not lazy. But your brain was not designed for the modern financial world. This is not an opinion. It is a conclusion supported by decades of research in evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. Let us begin with the most basic fact. Your brain's basic wiring is about 200,000 years old. Some structures are even older. The brainstem and limbic system have been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. Homo sapiens as a species appeared around 300,000 years ago. But the modern financial world as you know it did not exist until the last few hundred years. Credit cards appeared in the 1950s. Index funds appeared in the 1970s. Online banking appeared in the 1990s. From an evolutionary perspective, the modern financial world is roughly 3 seconds old. Your brain has not had time to adapt. The psychologist Leda Cosmides and the anthropologist John Tooby founded the field of evolutionary psychology in the 1980s and 1990s. Their central insight was simple but powerful. The human brain is not a general-purpose computer. It is a collection of specialized circuits that evolved to solve specific problems faced by our ancestors. These problems included finding food, avoiding predators, choosing mates, and navigating social hierarchies. None of those circuits evolved to help you understand compound interest, diversification, or retirement planning. The brain is using ancient tools to solve brand new problems. Sometimes those tools work well. Sometimes they fail dramatically. One of the most studied biases in modern psychology is called temporal discounting. This term was introduced by economists and psychologists studying how people make choices over time. Temporal discounting means that the human brain consistently values a smaller reward today over a larger reward in the future. The further away the reward, the less your brain cares about it. The classic experiment on this topic was conducted by the psychologist Walter Mischel at Stanford University in the 1960s and 1970s. This became known as the marshmallow test. Young children were offered a choice. They could eat one marshmallow immediately, or they could wait 15 minutes and receive 2 marshmallows instead. Follow-up studies found that children who could wait longer tended to have better life outcomes in certain areas. But more recent research has challenged some of those conclusions. What is not debated is that waiting is hard. The immediate reward feels real and present. The delayed reward feels abstract and distant. This is not a character flaw. It is how the brain works. The neuroscientist Samuel McClure and his colleagues published a landmark study in 2004 using functional magnetic resonance imaging. They scanned people's brains while they made choices between smaller immediate rewards and larger delayed rewards. They found that 2 different brain systems were active. The limbic system, which is associated with emotion and immediate gratification, was more active when the immediate reward was available. The prefrontal cortex, which is associated with reasoning and planning, was more active when people were able to wait. These 2 systems compete with each other every time you make a financial decision. The economists David Laibson and George Lowenstein have done extensive work on a related concept called hyperbolic discounting. This is a specific mathematical pattern of how people discount future rewards. Standard economic models assumed that discounting was exponential, meaning the rate of discounting was constant over time. But Laibson and Lowenstein showed that human discounting is hyperbolic. This means that people discount the near future at a much steeper rate than the distant future. Here is what that looks like in real life. The difference between today and tomorrow feels enormous. The difference between day 365 and day 366 feels very small. Your brain is not being irrational or inconsistent. It is following a hyperbolic discounting curve that has been measured in dozens of studies across multiple countries and cultures. Another powerful bias is loss aversion. The psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky are the giants in this field. They developed prospect theory in 1979. Which fundamentally changed how economists and psychologists understand decision-making under uncertainty. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002 for this work. Tversky had died in 1996 and was not eligible. Prospect theory showed that human beings do not evaluate outcomes in terms of final states of wealth. Instead, they evaluate outcomes in terms of gains and losses relative to a reference point. Losses loom larger than gains. Losing $100 hurts about twice as much as winning $100 feels good. Kahneman and Tversky found this pattern across many different contexts. The ratio of loss aversion is consistently around 2 to 1. Some studies have found slightly higher or lower ratios depending on the context, but the basic pattern is robust. This bias helped ancient humans survive. If you lost your food or your shelter, the consequences were severe and often fatal. So the brain developed a strong alarm system for potential losses. But in the modern world, this same alarm system can cause problems. The brain treats a small drop in the value of an investment the same way it once treated a predator approaching the cave. The heart rate increases. The stress hormones cortisol and adrenaline rise. The thinking becomes rushed and narrow. The neuroscientist Brian Knudsen and his colleagues have studied the brain's reward system using functional magnetic resonance imaging. They found that the nucleus accumbens, a region associated with anticipating rewards, becomes active when people see the possibility of a gain. But the anterior insula, a region associated with pain and disgust, becomes active when people face the possibility of a loss. These are two different brain systems pulling in two different directions. Now let us talk about social comparison. The psychologist Leon Festinger introduced social comparison theory in 1954. His insight was that human beings have a drive to evaluate themselves by comparing themselves to others. When objective measures are not available, people compare themselves to similar others. From an evolutionary perspective, social comparison was a survival tool. In tribal times, falling behind the group meant losing access to food, protection, and mating opportunities. So the brain developed a constant alertness to where you stand relative to others. Today, this system is still running. But the comparison group is no longer the 50 or 100 people in your immediate tribe. It is everyone you see on social media, television, movies, and the street. The brain does not know the difference between a real neighbor and an influencer on Instagram. It just knows that someone else has more and the alarm goes off. The psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Victoria Husted-Medvec studied what they called the silver lining effect. They found that people are surprisingly bad at predicting how they will feel about future outcomes. The movies, television shows, and social media posts you see create a mental model of what happiness looks like. That mental model is often wrong. Another important bias is the availability heuristic. Kahneman and Tversky introduced this term in 1973. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut where the brain estimates the likelihood of an event based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can easily remember a plane crash, you might overestimate the danger of flying. If you can easily remember a lottery winner, you might overestimate your chances of winning. The problem is that the ease of recall is not the same as actual probability. Dramatic, emotional, or recent events are easier to remember. Routine, boring, or distant events are harder to remember. Your brain uses ease of recall as a proxy for probability, even though the two are not the same. The psychologist Paul Slovic has done extensive research on risk perception. He found that people's perception of risk is not based on objective statistics. It is based on factors like dread, novelty, and controllability. A risk that feels dreadful, unfamiliar, and uncontrollable will be perceived as much larger than an objectively equal risk that feels mundane, familiar, and controllable. This has direct implications for financial decisions. The stock market can feel dreadful and uncontrollable, especially after a crash. A savings account feels familiar and controllable, even if it is losing value to inflation. The brain's perception of risk does not always match the actual mathematical risk. Let us talk about the pain of paying. The economist Richard Thaler introduced the concept of mental accounting, which we will discuss later. But the psychologist Ofer Zeller-Meyer studied the specific phenomenon of the pain of paying. He found that the act of paying activates the insula, the same brain region that responds to pain. This is not metaphorical. The brain literally feels some discomfort when money leaves your possession. The payment method changes the intensity of that pain. The psychologist Priya Raghubir and the economist Joydeep Srivastava studied the difference between cash and credit cards. They found that people are willing to spend significantly more when using credit cards compared to cash. The physical act of handing over cash activates the pain centers more strongly than swiping a card or clicking a mouse. This is not because credit card users are foolish. It is because the timing of the pain signal is different. With cash, the pain happens immediately at the moment of purchase. With credit cards, the pain is delayed until the bill arrives days or weeks later. The brain is simply responding to the timing of the feedback. Delayed feedback produces weaker learning. The psychologist George Lowenstein has written extensively about what he calls the hot-cold empathy gap. This is the tendency for people to underestimate how much their behavior will change when they are in a hot state characterized by emotion, hunger, arousal, or stress. When you are calm and rational, you might make a plan. But when you are tired, hungry, stressed, or excited, the plan falls apart. Your calm self does not fully understand how your stressed self will behave. This is not a failure of willpower. It is a failure of prediction. The brain in a cold state cannot accurately simulate the brain in a hot state. Walter Mischel, the psychologist who created the marshmallow test, also developed a framework for understanding self-control. He distinguished between cool cognitive systems and hot emotional systems. The cool system is slow, deliberate, and located in the prefrontal cortex. The hot system is fast, emotional, and located in the limbic system. The hot system develops earlier in childhood and is more powerful under stress. Financial decisions are often made in hot states. The car salesman creates urgency. The online store shows a countdown timer. The news headlines scream about a market crash. These triggers activate the hot system and shut down the cool system. The brain is not designed to make careful long-term decisions when it feels threatened or excited. Let us discuss the endowment effect. The economist Richard Thaler first described this phenomenon in 1980, drawing on earlier work by Kahneman and Tversky. The endowment effect is the tendency for people to value something more highly once they own it. In a classic experiment, researchers gave one group of participants a coffee mug and then asked them how much money they would accept to sell it. Another group of participants were asked how much they would pay to buy the same mug. The sellers demanded roughly twice as much as the buyers were willing to pay. The act of owning the mug changed the brain's valuation of it. The neuroscientist Greg Burns and his colleagues studied the endowment effect using functional magnetic resonance imaging. They found that the act of owning an object activates the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with subjective value. Once the brain encodes something as mine, it assigns higher value to it. This is automatic and unconscious. This effect has implications for financial decisions. Investments that you already own feel more valuable than identical investments you do not own. A house you live in feels more valuable than an identical house down the street. The brain does not see these things objectively. It sees them through the lens of ownership. Now let us turn to the sunk cost fallacy. This bias has been studied extensively by the psychologists Hal Arks and Catherine Bloomer. They defined the sunk cost fallacy as the tendency to continue an endeavor once an investment of money, effort, or time has been made, even when the current costs outweigh the benefits. In a classic experiment, Arks and Bloomer asked participants to imagine that they had spent $100 on a ticket for a ski trip to Michigan and $50 on a ticket for a ski trip to Wisconsin. They then learned that the Michigan trip was actually more enjoyable than the Wisconsin trip. Most participants chose to go to Michigan, which was the more expensive trip that they had already paid for. The rational choice would be to ignore the cost of the tickets, since that money was spent either way, and choose the more enjoyable trip. But the brain could not ignore the sunk cost. The neuroscientist Benedetto DiMartino and his colleagues studied the neural basis of the sunk cost fallacy. They found that activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the orbitofrontal cortex was associated with overcoming the fallacy. People with damage to these brain regions were more susceptible to the sunk cost effect. Let us talk about confirmation bias. This term was introduced by the psychologist Peter Wason in 1960. He conducted experiments where participants were given a rule and asked to test it. Most participants looked for evidence that confirmed their hypothesis rather than evidence that contradicted it. Wason called this confirmation bias. The neuroscientist Tali Sharot and her colleagues have studied the optimism bias, which is related to confirmation bias. The optimism bias is the tendency for people to overestimate the likelihood of positive events and underestimate the likelihood of negative events. This bias is mediated by the rostral anterior cingulate cortex and the inferior frontal gyrus. The brain literally processes positive information about the self more readily than negative information. When the brain receives good news about the future, the neural signal is strong and clear. When the brain receives bad news, the signal is weaker and more easily ignored. This is not a design flaw. It is a protective mechanism. The brain shields itself from information that would cause distress. But that same protective mechanism can lead to systematically biased financial decisions. Psychologists have also studied the planning fallacy. Kahneman and Tversky introduced this term in 1979. The planning fallacy is the tendency for people to underestimate how long tasks will take and how much they will cost, even when they have relevant past experience. In a famous study, Kahneman and Tversky asked a group of experienced professors to estimate how long it would take them to finish a book manuscript. The average estimate was about 2 years. The actual average time was about 7 years. Only one professor finished in the time they had estimated. Kahneman later wrote about the planning fallacy in his book Thinking Fast and Slow. He distinguished between the inside view and the outside view. The inside view focuses on the specifics of the current project and imagines a best-case scenario. The outside view asks how long similar projects have taken in the past. The brain naturally defaults to the inside view because the inside view feels more vivid and relevant. The outside view feels abstract and impersonal. But the outside view is almost always more accurate. The psychologist Robert Cialdini has studied the concept of consistency and commitment. He found that once people make a public commitment, they tend to behave consistently with that commitment even when the original reason for the commitment no longer applies. This is related to cognitive dissonance, a theory developed by Leon Festinger in 1957. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort you feel when your beliefs and your actions do not match. The brain wants to resolve that discomfort. It can resolve it by changing the action or by changing the belief. Often, the brain changes the belief because that requires less energy. This is why someone can say they value financial security but then take risks that undermine that security. The brain has quietly adjusted the belief to match the action. The psychologist Roy Baumeister and his colleagues developed the theory of ego depletion. They proposed that self-control draws from a limited resource that can be exhausted. In a typical experiment, participants who exerted self-control on an initial task performed worse on a subsequent task that also required self-control. This theory has been debated in recent years. Some replication studies have failed to find the effect. But even the critics acknowledge that mental effort is not free. The brain consumes metabolic energy. When the brain is tired, stressed, or hungry, decision-making deteriorates. The psychologist Kathleen Voss has studied the connection between self-control and financial behavior. She found that people with lower trait self-control have higher levels of credit card debt and lower levels of savings. This relationship holds even after controlling for income and education. Self-control is a measurable individual difference that predicts financial outcomes. Let us now discuss mental accounting. Richard Thaler developed this concept in 1985. Mental accounting is the tendency for the brain to treat money differently depending on where it came from and what it is designated for. A tax refund feels like free money even though it is exactly the same as any other money you earned. Money in a savings account feels untouchable even for a legitimate emergency. Money in cash feels more real than money in a bank account. These mental accounts are not real. Money is fungible. $1 is exactly the same as any other dollar. But the brain does not treat them as the same. The brain creates categories and rules. Those categories and rules are often irrational in an economic sense, but they are psychologically real. The psychologist Eldar Shaffer and the economist Sendel Mlanran have studied the psychology of scarcity. They propose that scarcity captures the attention and creates a tunneling effect. When you are short on money, time, or food, the brain focuses intensely on the scarce resource. This focus improves your ability to solve immediate scarcity problems. But it also reduces your ability to think about long-term issues. The tunnel vision helps you survive the present but blinds you to the future. In one study, farmers in India performed worse on cognitive tests before the harvest, when they were poor, than after the harvest, when they had money. The same farmers with the same brains had different cognitive performance depending on their financial situation. Scarcity itself was causing a temporary reduction in mental bandwidth. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky has studied the effects of stress on the brain. Chronic stress damages the hippocampus, a region critical for memory and learning. Stress also impairs the prefrontal cortex and strengthens the amygdala. The brain under chronic stress becomes more reactive and less reflective. It fights fires instead of building fire prevention systems. Financial stress is a real stressor. The brain does not distinguish between a financial threat and a physical threat. Both trigger the same stress response. Both damage the same brain regions over time. This creates a feedback loop. Financial stress makes the brain worse at financial decisions. Worse financial decisions create more financial stress. The anthropologist Joseph Henrich and his colleagues have studied how the human brain evolved for social learning. Humans are not just good at learning from experience. They are exceptionally good at learning from other people. This is called cumulative cultural evolution. Each generation builds on the discoveries of previous generations. But this social learning mechanism also has a downside. The brain is biased to copy what most people are doing and what high-status people are doing. This is generally efficient. Copying the majority and copying the successful saves you from having to learn everything from scratch. But in the modern financial world, the majority and the successful are often not good models. The majority carries credit card debt. The successful people you see on social media are often performing wealth rather than possessing it. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has studied the social intuitionist model of moral judgment. His research suggests that moral judgments are often driven by intuition and emotion, with rational reasoning coming in afterwards to justify the intuition. The same pattern applies to financial judgments. You might feel that a certain investment is good. Then your rational brain comes up with reasons to support that feeling. The reasoning comes after the feeling. The feeling came first. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. These patients had normal intelligence and normal memory, but they could not make real-world decisions. They could reason about hypothetical scenarios but could not make choices that served their long-term interests. Damasio concluded that emotion is not a distraction from rational decision-making. Emotion is a necessary component of it. The brain without emotion cannot assign value to different options. This is a crucial insight. Your financial brain is not supposed to be purely rational. It is supposed to integrate emotion and reason. The problem is not that you have emotions about money. The problem is that the emotional systems evolved for a world that no longer exists. Your emotions are calibrated for a tribal environment, not a global economy. The psychologist Dan Ariely has studied dishonesty and self-deception. His research shows that people can cheat and still feel honest by engaging in what he calls fudge factor reasoning. They cheat a little but not enough to feel like cheaters. The brain has an extraordinary capacity to justify its own behavior. This self-justification mechanism helps maintain a positive self-image. But it also allows the brain to ignore financial mistakes rather than learn from them. So here is where we are. Your brain is not broken. Your brain is not lazy. Your brain is not stupid. Your brain is a remarkable survival machine that kept your ancestors alive for 200,000 years. But the modern financial world is brand new in evolutionary terms. Credit cards did not exist. Compound interest as a formal concept did not exist. Diversified investment portfolios did not exist. Retirement as a concept did not exist for most of human history. The psychologist Steven Pinker has written about the mismatch between our evolved brains and the modern world. He argues that many modern problems, from obesity to addiction to financial distress, can be understood as mismatches. A brain that evolved to crave sugar and fat in an environment of scarcity now lives in an environment of abundance. A brain that evolved to respond to immediate threats now lives in a world of abstract financial risks. Your brain is not designed to stay broke on purpose. It is designed to survive. And survival in the ancient world looked very different from financial health in the modern world. The same brain systems that helped your ancestors avoid a predator now cause you to avoid checking your bank account. The same brain systems that helped your ancestors secure a mate now cause you to compare yourself to strangers on Instagram. The same brain systems that helped your ancestors eat when food was available now cause you to spend money when credit is available. Understanding how your brain actually works is the first step. Not to fix it. Your brain does not need to be fixed. It needs to be understood. The more you understand about temporal discounting, loss aversion, the availability heuristic, mental accounting, the endowment effect, confirmation bias, the planning fallacy, cognitive dissonance, and the hot-cold empathy gap, the less you will blame yourself for being weak or lazy or stupid. You are not weak. You are not lazy. You are not stupid. You are a human being with a human brain. And your human brain was designed for a world that no longer exists. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It is not financial advice. Your financial decisions are your own. Consult a licensed professional before making any major financial change.